Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Towards the end of section 2 of his Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, Immanuel Kant spends some time talking about other principles of morality, all of which ultimately come back to what he calls heteronomy of the will. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but you notice that on the board here we've got a number of different principles, or essentially grounds for moral theories set out for them. And what we're going to do is talk about each of them. First, we're going to talk about what each of them is, what it is that they say morality consists in. Then we'll talk about Kant's criticisms of each of these and why they end up being a type of heteronomy. And then we'll finish by talking about what sort of ordering Kant gives to them. He says that they're all bad, but some of them are less bad, or at least better in some respects, than the other ones. So what is heteronomy to begin with? Heteronomy is opposed to autonomy, which is when the will gives itself its own determination. And for Kant, determination in terms of morality, that is in terms of our duties and what we ought to do and what the good is, all these sorts of things, he conceives of this in terms of laws or rules, norms, if you like. So to be autonomous means not only to choose for yourself or to determine yourself, but it's to actually give yourself laws, to give yourself the principles, the guiding norms by which you are going to make moral decisions and engage in moral action. So what is heteronomy then? Well, in heteronomy, instead of the will deciding for itself, or the person through their will deciding for themselves, instead you have some sort of object, and it's the object's, as he says, relation to the will, providing it with some sort of inducement, some sort of interest, appealing to, for example, the will's liking this particular thing, or being drawn by desire or by inclination. That is what determines the will. So quite literally, it's law or rule by another. Heteros means other. And so Kant says there's four main ways in which we can distinguish the moral principles by which a person would have a heteronomous will. He says that two of these are what he calls empirical, that is based on our experience. They're based on some things that we encounter in experience and then draw from them. And then two of them are what he calls rational, which means that they appeal to things that go beyond the realm of our experience. And they're not, for that matter, necessarily false or anything like that, but they are not found solely within our experience. So what are these? On the side of the empirical, he first says individual, or it can be translated sometimes as private or personal, eigenen happiness. And Kant has a particular conception of happiness. Happiness is the satisfaction of all of our inclination and desires. That is what he thinks happiness consists in. So that is one thing. What would that be as a moral theory or as a principle? It'd say, well, you should do what is actually going to make you happy. So you should behave in a good way because that's actually going to make you happy. It'll make you, successful, or people will like you, or you won't get in trouble. So that's that theory. Then Kant says there's also moral feeling. right? Gefühl in German, a very similar sense. But this is what we would talk about in terms of feeling compassion or sympathy, or to use a word that people love to throw around these days, empathy. And there were indeed some moral theories that were basing themselves, at least in part, on the notion of sympathy. Hume and Adam Smith talk about this. Jean-Jacques Rousseau thinks that this plays an important role in morality. So you have some representatives of this. Then on the other side of the rational, what he calls the principle of perfection, we're dealing with something that's a bit more metaphysical or a bit more abstract. And he talks first about the principle of perfection, Vollkommenheit in German. And here we would think about many of what we typically call today virtue ethics, ethics of personal realization, of becoming the best you, any of those sorts of things. Those would be what he's calling this principle of perfection. And the idea is that there's some sort of, either it's human nature as such, or it's, the reality as such, and you want to realize the full potential of it and come to the fully developed state for the kind of being that we are, that is human being. Then, the fourth, we have a divine will or command, something coming to us from God or the gods or whatever, however else we conceive of as the divine, and it tells us what we ought to do. Why is this placed under the principle of perfection? Well, because it's understood as coming from a divinely perfect will. In this case, we're trying to have a divinely perfect will. In this case, there's some sort of divinely perfect will out there that we're somehow tapping into or fortunate enough to receive a revelation by. Now, all of these are problematic according to Kant. Why are they problematic? Let's start at the bottom again with individual happiness. Kant says that, look, as a moral theory, it's just false to begin with, right? It says that prosperity or doing well or success or, getting what it is that you want is somehow proportional to good conduct. And all you have to do is have a bit of experience to know that's not actually true. There are bad people who do prosper in the world. There are good people who have terrible outcomes, sometimes precisely by being good and having the bad people do things to them. So it's false to begin with. Worse than that, Kant thinks that it actually undermines morality by providing us with the wrong sort of inducement. So when we're telling children, hey, you need to behave so that people will like you, you need to behave so you won't be punished, or you need to behave so I'll give you some candy, or you need to behave so Santa Claus will bring you candy, or whatever, we're really screwing them up according to Kant. We're giving them the wrong inducements and giving them a false principle to work by. When we come to the other principle of happiness, that of moral feeling, Kant has a few other things to say. They all essentially boil down to you cannot base morality on feeling. Why can't you base morality on feeling? Because it's an uncertain guide. It's not a reliable guide to morality. You might feel one way at one moment and then feel another way at another moment. Some people don't seem to have a lot of moral feelings. This can't be an adequate guide. Plus, you can't expect that people are going to have the right feelings. You can't tell somebody, feel sympathy. I mean, you can tell them. It's just not going to produce the result that you want. So this is not going to be a particularly effective guide. Kant says one other thing about it too. This is a substitute for people who don't want to think and would rather just feel when it comes to morality. He sees that as a bad thing. Now, when it comes to these other parts, he says the problem with the principle of perfection is that it's ontological, but it's empty. It's indefinite. We don't really know what it means to say that a human being would develop, to the greatest degree possible or fulfill their potential or anything along these lines, in part because that's a indeterminate notion. It could mean a lot of different things. He says another issue is trying to distinguish the reality that we're speaking from every other. We end up kind of going in a circle. This ends up being very murky. And so Kant says that's not going to be an adequate guide for us either. Then when it comes to the divine will or command, Kant says, look, we don't actually have any intuition of divine perfection. We don't know what a divinely perfect will would be. So we end up relying upon our own ideas in doing so. And this leads to all sorts of problems. He says we can only deduce it from our own conceptions. So either we're deriving it from moral conceptions. We think of God as being like super good and all that, which is fine. But then let's just rely on morality itself and not do that. Or we rely on conceptions like desire of glory, dominion, might, vengeance, all those sorts of things. And in that case, Kant says, look, if you're going to try to establish a system of morality on those grounds, you're actually going very far away from morality. You may as well, in that case, just go for the private happiness, because as bad as that is, it's not as bad as this over here. And so that leads us to the third thing. Kant thinks that this appeal to the divine will is really off base. It's going to lead us astray. Remember, too, that Kant is indeed writing after centuries of religious warfare in Europe. Recent experience of that sort of thing. He says that if we have to choose between principles of happiness, we should go with moral feeling. That's better, at least, than is individual happiness. Why? Because moral feeling at least acknowledges that there's something desirable about morality in itself. Whereas this says, no, morality, it's just there so that you stay out of trouble, get the things that you want. What's really good is the things that you want, right? This actually, in an inchoate way, recognizes it. And likewise, the principle of, you might call it, development of the human person, at least recognizes something. And it's sort of on the way to autonomy, but not there. So all of these fit into different types of heteronomy, and none of them, according to Kant, can furnish us with an adequate ground or principle for morality.